Hello and welcome to this very special 1-hour edition of Mind Community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey, as always. Thanks for your time. As we come to the end of the month of June and prepare to move on to another parish, we have decided to share with you all of the information we collected from the kind people of St. George who came forward willingly and shared freely. One such individual is Desmond Critchlow, who spent his formative years here in St. Jude's. In fact, the entire area and the surrounding communities became his playground. For the next hour, Desmond takes us on a special journey. Let us begin by placing things in the correct perspective. Desmond?
St. Jude's was one of those free villages which was not attached to a plantation after slavery. And it became a center for all of the districts around it. That happened largely because they built 2 schools here and an Anglican church. And they had some of the most established rum shops in the area. They had a standpipe, which is now a shadow of itself. The villages that surround St. Jude's are places with pretty colorful names like Macaroni Village, Superlative, Prerogative, Ashbury, Golden Ridge, Cottage, Beige Village, and some parts of Drax Hall, Hope. But St. Jude's is a center, and all of the shops in this area, indeed, when I came up, there were 3 shops. One was right here where these cars are parked. It was belonging to this white family called the Hutchinson family. It was run by a lady called Miss Hutchinson. The second was a rum shop, which is right here. It was owned by a gentleman called Mr. Natty Holder. And he handed it over to his son, Victor Holder. And I'm talking about the 50s, and late 40s, 50s. When Victor died about 10 years ago, he handed it over to his son, Vernon, who is right in the shop now, and he's running it. So it came through 3 generations. The other rum shop, as we call it, belongs to a man called Alfred Gorin. This is a very substantial building, which I want you to film and I want you to see. It is not in anybody's memory in this district as to when it was built. And there are people around here who are over 90 years old. So it caused me to a little research to discover some posits which have to be proven, but I can tell you what they are. There's a man called Waterman Straw, who is a celebrated person in St. George history, St. John, who owned all of the land west of Mr. Gorin's rum shop. And in fact, my parents rented from Waterman Straw. Even although he died, the land remained in his name. And I can say to you, the land is still in his name to this day. They haven't sold it out. There was some efforts to do that and never succeeded. But all the lands west of that building belongs to Waterman Straw, and some other lands in St. Jude's also belong to him. So he owned extensive properties in this area. So when we spoke to some of the people, we recognized that was a great hurricane in 1831, which caused a lot of damage and destruction. And Waterman Straw was one of the people who became a boss mason, a stone master mason, who helped the people in St. John, St. John Church, here in St. Jude's, and also at Kendall Plantation and Draxall Plantation. We suspect that having bought all this land, he was instrumental in persuading the owners of that spot to build a secure building so that it couldn't be destroyed by the hurricane. And you'll see that it is a very, very secure building. I've never known it to be anything other than a rum shop. And surprisingly, it was a shelter during hurricanes. In addition to this school, which couldn't hold all the people from the area, that building was strong enough. And it also sheltered, I ran in there from the 1955 Janet hurricane. I can barely remember, I was quite small. St. Jude's, as I said, is surrounded by these districts. Now, one of the districts that is very, very important is Prerogative, which is on the eastern side of St. Jude's, very close. Prerogative was a plantation which was sold in the 1930s, I understand. And it was bought by 3 men from this area who returned from Panama. I only discovered that very recently. The names of these persons were Mr. Theophilus Holmes, Alfred Papa Green, and Doddridge Prince. These are the names coming from the residents here, and some of his relatives still live there and on these buildings. But only one of they came back and they built 3 big wall houses. Only one of them now is still standing. But Prerogative House, which a lot of people in Barbados know of, is there. That was the original plantation house. But it has that Panama connection, which I thought was very, very important. Now, in the 50s, and so as we know, rum shops were the thing. Nobody could go anywhere. There's not a lot of transportation, so you got everything from the rum shop. You buy flour, you can buy an ounce of butter, you can buy a gill of lard oil, you can get a snap of rum, or you can get Bishop. Bishop is the big one. And you can do anything. The rum shop, as you know, is set out in a way with a large counter. And on the counter has scales with a poise in those days. And the method was to use brown paper. So if you wanted an ounce of butter, he had like something like a cocoa stick would cut off the butter. He bought it in bulk, put it on the brown paper and throw it in the scale. And if you want an ounce, get an ounce. You want 2 ounces, and that sort of thing. If you want, in those days, lard oil was a big thing. You get a gill of lard oil, you bring your own bottle, or he would supply you the bottle, and you can get that. Or you can buy a bottle of rum. Rum was sold in 2 ways, really. You could purchase a bottle. In those days, you can get a nip, a small one called a nip. A medium size was 3 gills, or you can get a 1.5 pints. Or you can go to the shop, and the rum came in open cask, and he would have a measuring rod. He will take out some and give you in a snap glass, and you can buy that. That would be a snap, or you can buy a Bishop, which is for the men. The stronger men used to like to call for the Bishop. Right? Afterwards, some of them didn't get home, as you would appreciate. So that is how the rum shops operated. Now, as I said, there was Miss Hutchinson, Mr. Holder, and Alfred Gorin. Alfred Gorin was one of the richest men in St. George. He owned a farm and lands in the back of the rum shop. And he had cows and goats and sheep, and he had a mule cart. In those days, mule carts was the main means of transporting canes for the poor people with canes. And he also had his own car. And I can remember the number is G56. I mean, that was a high number in those days. These days, we probably have 10,000. And he was the man who transported people to the doctor. He transported people to weddings. He took brides to weddings. And he took people to funerals. He was the transport person because he was the only vehicle around. Other than that, you had to find somebody with a bicycle to carry you to the doctor. Now, in those days, each parish had a doctor. The government appointed a doctor for each parish. And the doctor for St. George was in a place called Buttles, about 4 to 5 miles from here. And the doctor in my day was a man called Dr. Reeder. If you wanted to get somebody to him on a bicycle, it was a challenge, because you had a lot of hills going down a place like the Old Work Hill, the Monk Hill, and even a little hill here we used to call Gorin Hill because of the importance of the man down there. And you had to go to him. And if you had to do that on a bicycle, it was tough. Sometimes it just couldn't happen. And the doctor would make house calls, but not very often. So when you go to the doctor, you had to carry your own bottle. The doctor was also the pharmacist. You carry your own bottle if you were to get medicine. The medicine in those days were actually all liquid. The medicine was in liquid form. So a bottle, Any kind of bottle. Any kind of bottle was good. But you could also get tablets. But people prefer liquid because it was easier to consume. And the doctor who, as I said, was also dispensed medicine, he was a pharmacist, would pour the thing in the bottle for you, or wrap the tablets up in brown paper and give it to you. You'll come home and take them. He would tell you how to take them, and people will come home and take them. So that is how that goes. Now, the main thing about St. Jude's, which made it so attractive, is the fact that all of these districts around St. Jude's that I called just now sent their children to this school here. And in those days, the schools were segregated. This was called the St. Jude's Boys' School, and the St. Jude's Girls' School is just up the road. In those days, the headmaster and the headmistress lived on the property, and you can see one of the houses still existing. Now, the church, which played a very important role, provided the first school, which is the St. Jude's Girls' School, and it had attached to it a house for the headmistress. This school here has a plaque, and it was built in 1940. But the St. Jude's Girls' School, I'm not sure about. But the house for this school was at the side of it, but over time it disappeared. This belongs to the government, but the St. Jude's Girls' School belonged to the church. So that when the government in the 1960s decided to disendow the church, they handed back that property to the church, and they decided to turn it into a church hall. It is now a hall for church activities and for a body called the Ermine Homes Trust.
As you are aware, naming conventions and monuments have captured our attention once again, especially in recent weeks. Who was Ermine Holmes?
Ermine Holmes was a very successful teacher, and she was the granddaughter of Theophilus Holmes, who came from Panama and bought part of the Prerogative Plantation. And her sister Trevor is still alive. And this hall here used to be the home of the headmistress of the St. Jude's Girls' School. I remember one of the last headmistress at this school was a lady called Miss Pitt, a very prim and proper woman. And when we were boys at that school, the boys' school, we could not come up here unless you get a good beating from the headmistress and then the headmaster. But this hall is now a philanthropic organization which looks after all of the elderly people, and the majority of people who are members are elderly people. Not a lot of young people. Some people do come, but they meet on Wednesdays at 10 o'clock, and a lot of younger people are at work and that sort of thing. Now, in the early days, the church controlled everything. The church was built on lands provided by Ashbury Plantation. Ashbury Plantation provided all of the lands for the church and the school and a vicarage, which is still there. And one of the priests built a windmill on the property of the vicarage. Or he probably found it there, I'm not too sure. That mill, we all went to that mill, took our canes and did our grinding. And people from the district, church people, would bring canes, grind canes, and we get our bottle of liquor, cane juice, and we can drink it and take it home.
The operation spoken about by Desmond required power in the wind. Now, what happened when the wind speed was not at the required rate?
Our task was to carry that mill around, and we would take it in turns and carry it around while the works are going. And bingo, we got our cane juice. But it was a nice windmill. It was not the standard size. It was half of what you will see now, and the base was also half. But it did the job. It had some small works in there which grind canes. The lands was donated by a man called Mr. Holder from Ashbury Plantation, and that church was built between 1833 and 1834. But it was consecrated in 1836, and that is when it became functional. I myself was baptized there, I was confirmed there, And I sang in the choir there. I even played the organ there. And the church was very, very influential. It was so popular that on Sundays, sometimes you had 4 church services. These days, you can barely get one. You had what we would call a 7 o'clock service, and which was communion, Holy Communion. And then we had an 11 o'clock service, which was a general service for church members and all the members of the community. And they came to that. Church was always full. Then at 3 o'clock, there was Sunday school, which I went to for quite a while, and then I was playing the organ for the Sunday school. And then there was something called night service, which started at 7 p.m. and lasted for an hour. Now, that is a typical Sunday in the 50s. An untypical Sunday would be a Sunday for Easter or Christmas, when you have about 5 services, because you'll start with 5 o'clock service, then you have a 7 o'clock service, an 11 o'clock service, a 3 o'clock service, and then another 7 at night. And that is true. The church was one of the main agents for spirituality and also entertainment. The church held fairs, dances, and excursions. Now, a church excursion was one of the most important events in this district. And most of the time they went north. They went to St. Lucie. The places I remember going to excursions down there was not River Bay so much, but Sherman's, Clinkett's, and Hartmut Fort, and Six Men's. On that western side of St. Peter and St. Lucie. Those were favorite spots for church excursion from all around Barbados, really. The truth about it is that we in St. George don't have any sea, so we always go to a place that has a sea. But the first time I went to the sea, and a lot of the youngsters around here with me, was when we went to an excursion. The first time we traveled in a bus was when we went to an excursion, because you go from home to the church, to the ram shop, to buy some groceries, and you're back home. And my first experience, and one or two of us, was not pleasant, because we had the wrong conception of how the sea works. We heard about the waves coming in. We thought they were coming in like the wind. We didn't realize they roll in. So you go on the thing and watch it rolling in and lose your balance, and you fall. And once that happened one time, it doesn't happen again. But we have very fond memories of Clinkett's, Sherman's, Half-Moon Fort. And those were the connections that St. George made with those parishes. One of the other important things about that is that to get in a bus and drive to Half-Moon Fort in those days, they were all wooden buses. It took a long time. The roads were poor, lots of corners, and the buses were small. But the beauty of going to some place like what I just mentioned is that you met a lot of other excursions there with lots and lots of people. It was a real mass gathering. The excursion were normally held on a bank holiday. In those days, they called them bank holidays. Nobody never said a holiday. And then here you are, and there are buses of all descriptions and colors at Half-Moon Fort, at Plinkett, and that took people like me and all the other youngsters by storm. We thought the only buses that were in Barbados were the St. George Bus Company, which passed it, which we'll talk about. But there were yellow buses trimmed with red, there were green buses, there were blue buses, there were all kinds of buses. The most important thing about those buses, they were all wooden buses. Had a tarpaulin, had a running board, and had 2 seats at the back that faced each other for the hawkers. And that was very, very, very exciting for somebody like me who was about 4, 5, 6 in the 50s. And we thanked the church for that. The church provided that. And the priest would come down in his car, he had a little car, and pull everybody in before we start to walk around and hold a short service. And everybody, as I said, like that. Let me then tell you about something that it always fascinates me. Funerals. Now, this crossing here is a very important thing, and I'm going to tell you why. There's a guy who used to live here, he was telling me about it only recently. Now, funerals in those days were like a set piece. If you die, the police is notified, and if there's no foul play, just like now, you pronounce you dead, and you can be buried the same day. In a lot of cases, the funeral occurred on the same day. If it didn't, it will occur the next day. There's no embalming. And there was an undertaker in Superlative, which is just around the corner by Freddie Mac, who owned the St. George Bus Company. And he was called Mr. Dowling Simpson. He was an undertaker. Once a runner goes to him and says somebody's dead, he'll send somebody with a tape measure to measure the person, and he'll go and prepare the coffin. Not a casket, it's a coffin. It's a simple box. And this is what happens. So that when he does that, he will come at the house and collect the body and take it to his parlor. He used to call it a funeral parlor, and put the body in this box. But before that, the people who prepared that body for burial were the midwives. They had all of these things that they put on. But I was trying to find out what they are. Probably will find out after the point. They had all of these things. They call it putting up a duppy, putting up a dead. Putting him up means cleaning the person off, woman or man, and putting these sweet things around to make them smell good and that sort of thing. But there's no embalming. And that would happen, and the body would go off to the undertaker. On the evening of the funeral, the body comes back to the house and reposes in the house. And people file through the house to see that body, and there was a lot of crying because the relationships were so close. But prior to that, let me just back up a little bit. When that person died, let's say today, like now, the wake starts immediately. A wake starts because once people know they're going to come to the house, they're going to bring rum, they're going to bring food, and they're singing. And that goes on until the person is buried. And when that person is buried, people go back to the house and finish up the wake. These days, the wake comes after the funeral, if there is one. But every funeral had a wake. It started a day or two before the burial, because within 3 days, the burial had to be completed. And this runner would go to the undertaker, would come to the priest, he would come to the grave digger who used to live here. Everybody was in close proximity. And that is how that went. Now, the funeral itself, there was, in those days, I remember this, really just barely remember, there was a procession in which there's a man called Bottleneck. You ever heard about that? Yes. Bottleneck. And this is a horse-drawn carriage I'm talking about. I know a little of the horse-drawn carriage and a little of the modern carriage. They would turn up with the body and put it in the house, and everybody is singing. The funeral is 4 o'clock. I mean, they're there since 12 or 11, and everybody's filing through the house. The funeral is 4 o'clock. 4:30, sorry, that was the time for funeral. So when 3:30 or 4, the funeral service will have a procession from the house to the church. And this is the procession. The procession is that the box is put into the hearse, the horse-drawn carriage, and behind the hearse, then you have walkers. At the front were women dressed in white and young girls. The second one was young boys, and at the back was men. However long that procession is, whoever comes to that funeral must go to the procession. And then if there are any, well, they were cyclists, bicyclists, not because motorcycles are a relatively modern invention. People rode bicycles to those funerals behind the hearse, not in front. And everything happened only after the body got here. And that procession would take off when Bottleneck gets into the carriage. I said, "Gee up," and the horses would move on. And they would come up the road very slowly. Now, they usually had difficulty with the horses turning that corner. But they would get them come here. These horses were trained, but you know, they still give problems. And I was told that when they got here, the horses couldn't decide where to go, even if you tell them where to go. This crossing here caused them some difficulty. Many times, people in this area told me this was the final place for the procession, because the pallbearers had to go and take their coffin out and walk to the church, because the horses would stay here. Up there's the graveyard, so they ain't going up there, apparently. Apparently, I don't. And they wouldn't go up there. A lot of times they did do it, but occasionally it didn't happen. So the pallbearers would take the coffin into the church, and it would start, and it was always a mournful occasion.
Now on to happier occasions here in the community of St. Jude's. Today, individuals are united in holy matrimony with little fanfare. That was not so in Desmond's childhood days. The entire community and the neighboring communities celebrated the occasion and heralded the newlywed.
Every wedding was held on a Sunday, no other day. I mean, unless you want to get married in the courts, you can go any day. If you want to get married, the church will only marry you on Sundays, as sometimes on Saturdays, but Sundays was the big day. In the districts, unlike now, they had what you call needle workers. And those needle workers were responsible for making the bride's dress and the fall. And people would get to know where the needle worker is, to line the streets where she's going to pass to come to the church. Once they know the needle worker, they will see the bride. Now, if the bride was, let's say, coming from Todd's or Greens, which is not close to here, those people, they would do it. But when it comes here, the driver of the car, there's a lead car, had a horn. For some reason, he could press his horn and it would play 1 or 2 songs, loud. And I'll tell you the name of the guy who had the thing, because his son is still there. They would either play Mary Had a Little Lamb or Here Comes the Bride. And you can hear that. The outside was still, there's no noise. You can hear that song from a mile away. Once he pressed that horn, everybody is going to come outside to see that bride and see that procession. And she comes to the church, bride always late, of course. And when it is done, there's so many people around. These days people get married, you don't know. There's so many people around watching this bride and wishing her well and wishing the groom well. Really joyous occasion. And the receptions were always, well, in St. Jude's, held at a private house where these people are going to live. And you had a lot of food. Bananas was a big thing, coconut water, rum, rice and stew, porn. Those sorts of things were big in those days. And the reception would have people outside just looking in. And if they could get a little snap from inside, that's fine with them.
From the church and the school, we moved to the entertainment spots in the community. Interestingly enough, there was one that served a dual purpose. It acted as a casino and a school.
There are casinos all over St. George, or were casinos all over St. George, which cater to dances and parties and that sort of thing. The most famous one there was Winter Garden Casino. I found myself surprisingly going to school at Winter Garden Casino. As a young boy, probably around 4, 5, I don't remember, because that casino on weekends was a place of entertainment, and during the week it was an educational institution. That is my first school I went to. At the time, the government would only take you into their primary school at St. Jude's if you were 5 years old. But my father said he wanted me to start earlier, and my grandmother lived in Greens where Winter Garden Casino was. So I went to live with her, and I went to school at Winter Garden. As soon as I became 5, I came back here. In fact, I was 6 when I came here, and I joined the class. These schools were segregated, as I said, but by 1956 or 57, it was integrated. And a lot of us boys were trepidated having girls sit inside of them. The point is we have sisters, but these girls, we don't know these girls. And it happened, the girls came from the girls' school down to the boys' school. The boys went up to the girls' school. A very big event that nobody can appreciate unless you was part of it. And the integration worked pretty well. I was quite happy to know some additional girls. And I wasn't as trepidated as some of the boys because I had 2 sisters. And we were roam and ramp all over the place. So I know what girls are like and what it would do and that sort of thing. I wasn't afraid at all. So that was part of it.
You might recall when we first started this series in January 2020, Dr. Carl Graves of Hope Road in St. Lucie spoke of the St. Lucie Progressive Club. There were also clubs here in St. George, and the word progressive was incorporated in at least one club's name.
At one stage in the 60s, when we grew up, we decided to form a youth group in St. Jude's. A youth group called the Progressive Youth Movement. It had a constitution and we used the school. We had to put a little pressure on the priest to allow us to use the school, but in final analysis, we got the keys from Miss Rogers and we opened the school. The youth movement was very popular because there was nothing happening in the district for younger people. I was the first treasurer, and we started there and we had over 100 members. In short order, we had a lot of people. And we had debating, we had speaking, and we had listening to music and dancing and all of the cultural things that would normally happen there. We then branched a little into sports, and we had a cricket team and a netball team. And then something big happened. We decided to set up a volleyball team. And all the guys in there came together. And I'm sure you all know about the exploits of Progressive volleyball team. It happened right from here and in that school, that pasture, and this pasture. Progressive won the national championships for about 4 or 5 years on a row. And the only body who dethroned them a little afterwards, they got a little complacent, was Deacons. So that's fine, we got to share the love. But some of the icons of that team, like John Stewart and Roy Stewart and Fabian Cox, all live in the area. Emerson has gone away, but I can go now. I think John Stewart is just around the corner. He was the captain of the Barbados team for years. And that is how that went. We actually used to travel from here to other youth groups. In St. Thomas, we'll go to Princess Margaret, we'll go to the Cultural Center in St. John. And how we got there? Archie Holder had a van that carried goods to and fro from his shop. And he said to me, once it is free at nights, you can use it. And we had to pay his chauffeur. And once Samuel, who was the chauffeur at the time, was free, about 7 or 8 o'clock, he'll bring the van out there and we'll load it up. And we're gone. We go to, as I said, the Ficus Club in St. Thomas. We go to Princess Margaret, all over the place. No. Then something else happened. We decided to form a choir in this school. And the only body who could play the piano was myself. And Mr. Critchlow was still alive, and he gave us one of his organs. My father gave the club one of his organs so that I can play it and we can have a choir. He wanted to see a choir band. So I followed in his footsteps and formed a choir within the Progressive Youth Movement. We held concerts and all sorts of things on this square right here. There was no fencing there. So people were all here sitting down and doing that, and it was full. We played all sorts of music and sang all sorts of music. In order to get it done properly, we had to borrow a truck from one of the people who had a cane truck in those days, in the 60s. And he would have reversed the truck between those walls out there with the back facing here. We would have put the choir on top of the truck and the organ. And we had a PR, we got a little sophisticated. We had a PR officer called Carl Padmore. He's now retired, not the guy from the sanitation, this guy. And he would advertise the concert, and people from all of those districts, Macaroni Village, Todd's, Newbury, would come to St. Jude's for this concert. And in those days, there were 2 representatives for St. Jude's in Parliament, and they would come and address the group, the people also, and they loved that. So that is part of the entertainment that was here.
What about social life? Rum shops, shopping in the community, liming, and of course, having fun.
In terms of social life in St. Jude's, the rum shop was the center. And each rum shop had and still have a bar, which is a little separate and distinct from where you can buy your groceries. And people would imbibe heavily, especially on Friday and Saturday nights when they got paid. People from 2 and 3 miles out would come to this shop. There's a place called Beige Village and Fairview. They're about a mile out. There's Ashbury, which is way up on top of the hill by Golden Ridge, and people from Golden Ridge would come to these shops here. But it was not as difficult as it is now, because there were a lot of cart roads, and they know the back roads. They knew how to get here. It was easier then. Although the groceries was heavy, you could still shorten the journey by coming through a cart road. What has happened is that some people have bought plantations, say like Ashbury Plantation, and they've blocked those cart roads. So people cannot come there. They have to catch the bus in Ashbury, go to Newbury, and then come here, which takes you 5 or 6 times as long. And in those days, if they did that, people would suffer very badly. But these days, lots of people have cars, but there's still a lot of people who wanted to use the cart roads to come to church. But that was denied, and it's still so, because the plantation said they wanted some privacy, which is okay, I guess. Now, entertainment here, as I said, was the rum shop. But I need to tell you this one. There's a man called Clarence Critchlow, my father, who lived in a board and shingle house below the Goring shop. And he rented that spot from Waterman Straw. That was a board and shingle house. But his strengths were that he was a musician par excellence. He formed a choir, a village choir, and it met in our house. They call it an 18 by 9. A little over half of this house was partitioned for bedroom, and on the other side was the living room. When the choir was meeting, all of the furniture from there would come out, and we would have the choir in there. There's an organ which he had, which would have been at the side there, and he would be playing that. Or my sister, I have a sister who is much older than me. She's a very, very good organist. She would be playing the organ. And all the people who would be in there, you had the bass, the tenor, and there were specialized people in this district who sang alto and that sort of thing. And there are people from other parts of the district, which I call the Greater St. Jude's, who joined that choir. And they would sing. Grand practice night, you couldn't get in this road. It's just, I mean, this is the 50s. Everybody's here, and all the rum shops are open. So there's entertainment going. And this is just one example of how a village choir was organized. He was the man behind it, and he can play, he can repair, he can do everything. He was what we call in those days a vocal musician. He could take a piece of music and read it and sing it. So he formed his choir. And that choir moved around this district singing songs. And in those days, they have a special thing called a service of songs, for which everybody wanted to come to. And his choir was on stage. That choir lasted for a very long time. And I spoke to my sister a few days ago. She said that's not the only choir he had. He had another choir in Sweet Bottom. He was the choir master. This choir was in a church. So he had that choir. And in fact, some of the members of that choir are still alive. I spoke to one recently and I was amazed. She was so happy to meet me. But I learned to play music at the hands of this guy. He was very punctilious, but in the final analysis, I played very well. So he would take his choir to other parishes, like St. Philip, St. John, and especially St. Joseph, and they would have competitions. Competition at service of songs. You have a service of song with 3 choirs or 4 choirs, and the audience got to vote who's the best. Now, he also took his choir to Queen's Park every year around Christmas and New Year's. And at Queen's Park was the mother of all service of songs. Service of songs for choirs from the entire island. And Mr. Critchlow was good enough to win some prizes still for St. George. He had his own organs, as I said. The night before he had an occasion out, he would hold what he used to call a grand practice. Once people heard about that grand practice, they would turn up outside of our house. There's no traffic to bother about. No donkey carts work at night. If a few car pass, one would be maximum. And they would be outside listening to these choirs at the grand practice. And then he would branch out into the districts and around the place. So that is part of the story. Now, the other aspect of entertainment in those days was something called a sing-in. I don't know if y'all ever heard of a sing-in. A sing-in was something not unlike a dance. It's not like a dance, but it was fairly similar. But surprisingly, if I give you the modern version of a sing-in, you'll die. The process was this: you had to pay to go to the singing. And in there, you do the singing. There was a Victrola, there's a gramophone with records. But records in those days were few and few between. There are a lot of juicy calypsos that came up that nobody had any records for. So there was always this master singer who would start the song. And the person who wanted to sing would catch on. That word catch on is something that was told to me, and I know of it, by a woman who is 92 years old. She reminded me that they never started the song themselves. The master singer would start singing the calypso, and anybody who knew the calypso would catch on and sing. If you begin to falter, he will come in and show you up. So the singings were there, and that was a form of entertainment. You had to pay, and there was music, there was black pudding and sauce, there was rum, there was all those things were sold. Other forms of entertainment in this era was mobile cinema. That was done by the Ministry of Education, coming out of what we then used to call the British Council. And they would send a van here with some film and some reels, and it would show on the St. Jude's pasture, or it would go to the Asbury pasture, or one of a good area. And everybody, since there's no cinema, there's no television, there's nothing. Everybody will come out to watch the mobile cinema. It was a very big hit. In those days, you may be surprised to know it was a lot cooler than it is now. And you had to get something put on because the wind blew fairly strong and you got cold. The major hit was a lot of educational programs on the mobile cinema. And the last program was always a comedy, either by a couple, two male people called Bud and Lou, or Charlie Chaplin. Nobody is going to leave until they see those two films. After that, there's a procession back home. There's a lot and lots of people on the road. Moonlight walks was something very, very popular. You just imagine there are no street lights, there's no electricity. Everybody's in their house at 6 or 7 o'clock at night until the moonlight comes out. Once the moonlight is up, people are walking around and playing. Even children will walk around and play. Moonlights were really, really good to get people out of the house. The next big feature which people really enjoyed and entertained was the landship. The landship in those days were local organizations. These days they're based more so in Bridgetown, but they had branches in St. George. They had a headquarters for the landship in St. George in the Glebe. And everybody come out to see the landship, see those nurses dancing and moving, the captains and that sort of thing. But the landship had another attraction, which when I spoke to some of the older people, they had something called a Mother Sally. Now, in those days, the Mother Sally was real. What you see is what she was. These days, the Mother Sally is a little padded. And I asked the lady, how come these people, she said, this is the real people and you had to find them. You got to go and choose them from wherever they are. And I enjoyed watching the Mother Sally. They would come, the landship would come and have their processions going. They would have a cloth on the streets where you throw the money for them to collect. And they would have a drumming kettle. And they had another instrument called a piccolo. I don't know if y'all ever heard of that. And these instruments would play, and people would dance, and the landship would dance. And that is how the landship operated. It would come out like once a month. And it would come out a lot of times when there's moonlight. And sometimes it would come out early evening.
We could not discuss the parish of St. George without speaking of the outstanding contribution of its well-known bus company, which incidentally manufactured buses in superlative St. George.
Now, the St. George bus company, I came along and found that bus company. They're all wooden buses with a tarpaulin on both sides. Both sides had tarpaulin. And on this side had a running board, which you can step up into. And the seats in the back were facing with a big space between for hawkers. Hawkers put a basket in there. Now, Mr. Dowling Simpson, who also owned the funeral home, owned the buses. All of the buses for the St. George Bus Company in that they were built in superlative. Every one. They're buildings down there, which you can see where they used to build them. But most of them, they were big sheds like, are gone. Those buses had specialized people building them. I remember there's a guy called Lee Bruce, lived somewhere in Bank Hall, who was the chief bus builder. All Mr. Gorin and the other people would do is import the engine and the chassis. And in those days, there were only two types, Austin or Bedford. Leyland came afterwards. And they had both types of buses down there. And we as boys knew every bus by the sound. We also knew them by the number, and we knew who was driving them, because the people who drove those buses drove the same bus every day, unless they were sick. So those buses apparently also knew the drivers. And there were three routes. One coming out of Marhill Street. The bus stand was in Marhill Street, coming to St. Jude's. Two, going up by St. George's Church and going to Greens. Those were the two routes. The third route was from Bridgetown to Sergeant Street in St. John. Now that was classified as Route 7. This was Route 8, and the one going to Greens was Route 8A. So the St. George Bus Company controlled all of the buses. It had two sets of people. One set was also living in St. John, but they all were built and repaired here, but they just managed one bus, which is Route 7 and Route 8. Now, I remember getting on those buses when I was small, and they seemed like so big. I mean, those buses were huge buses because you never used to go to town. My mother would go to town, or my sister would go. If I want a pair of shoes, they would put a stick, measure my foot, and go to town with a stick and put the stick in the shoe. In a lot of cases, choices weren't really big, so they would take the one that's closest. It was either too big or too small. Now, you know the consequences. If it's too big, they have a solution. They stuff the front with paper. If it's too small, they tell you, bear with it, it can stretch. I don't know if any of those shoes that stretch that much that to cause your toe to be not discomforted. But some of these shoes were bang on. But that is how we get to town. And those buses behave, you'll never believe this, like how the modern minibuses behave. They would carry lunch for people working in cane fields. There was something called a carrier for lunch. And once you give that to the driver, you can tell him who it is. After a while, you just all give him. He's going to stop that bus, and the man is going to come and pick it up. Right there, the ZR's buses do gas and carry people with groceries. The driver of those buses, they don't have any bus stops. They stop anywhere. And they would accommodate whoever they would want to be accommodated. They would stop anywhere. They would go ahead and take messages. Like I had some relatives in Bridgetown, if they want to come by my father to spend a day, she tell the bus driver. He can pass by my father's house and blow the horn. I come outside of my mother. So-and-so coming up tomorrow. I said, fine. That is how we would know. And that is the way the bus company worked. Very formal, it worked well. The bus company, those buses had something called a spy. I hear about a spy. He is the man who will make sure that the money that's coming is right. And nobody knows when the spy is going to come out. You'll go and stop somewhere in Charter Road Bridge, the spy come. And he's reckoning the people who is there. Now, he don't know who got off before or who going to get off, but he'll reckon them. And the person who is running the bus company will have a good idea of how much money should come in. It was on time. You had a bus leaving St. Jude's at 8 o'clock, one leaving at 9 o'clock, and you had a school bus. And that was pretty much set. You can rely on that. Sometimes the buses break down, but most of the times, you didn't have any difficulty with the bus. You know the bus is a 1 o'clock bus, so you get on the road about 5 minutes to 1. It's not going to come early. It may come a little late, but it's going to come.
How comforting. The story of the bus company of St. George, its contribution not only to this parish, but to others. In many communities, there was a very well-respected lady who performed one of the more crucial roles in the community. Her hands were the first to touch you, to hold you, and to caress you.
Now, in these districts, some of the most important people were midwives. Now, we told you about Miss Rogers, and the past by her house it looks just like when she was in it. The difference is it doesn't have any shingles. It's like that. And she lived for quite a while. There was another midwife in Greens, called a Critchlow. I'm not sure how it goes. But she and Miss Rogers delivered all of the babies in these districts. Nobody went to any hospital. They delivered the babies. And they dress in white, like a nurse, with a cape on the head and white pumps called shoes. When you see a midwife pass like that, everybody let her pass because she knows she's going where she's going. And she had great respect in the district. The midwife will go and deliver the baby and look after the mother for 7 days. On the 8th day, the midwife would bring the mother and the baby out for a walk and to be introduced to all the neighbors. So nobody couldn't say they didn't know, and it was so close that people expected that to happen. And after that day, once the mother walked with the midwife, she couldn't touch the baby. The midwife is carrying the baby. And midwife would bathe it and bathe her, that sort of, at the house and that sort of thing. At the end of this 7th day and the 8th day, the mother can walk the baby herself. And the midwife will come and pay occasional visits once she's okay. And that is how that will go.
The community of Greens has been immortalized in poetry by Barbados' first poet laureate, Esther Phillips. Its sister community, St. Jude's, has also been immortalized.
Now, there's one thing about St. Jude's which people talk about, a result of Timothy Callender writing this short story. And I don't know if he wrote this short story as a result of what he saw or what he heard, but St. Jude's was a district which was very close. And you couldn't come in St. Jude's and do anything wrong and somebody don't know. And it's possible that it could be an altercation. There are a lot of characters in St. Jude's, lots of characters. And I have some of the names written there, you may not want them. But they are all dead. There was a guy from St. Louis who came here to live, and he lived quite well. And they called him a strange sailor. He was a very, very prominent and in-your-face kind of guy. There was a woman called Sybil Scrubber. In those days, you had to scrub furniture. You never lacquer and varnish a table. You scrub it, carry it and scrub it. And she specializes in that. There was another lady who had very colorful language to deal with. She loved that language. And her name was also colorful. Her name was Pakalaka. I remember her very well, and she lived down the road. Very nice lady until you trouble her. And you had other characters who lived right here. There's a guy called Selassie. He used to pump the organ at the church, because in those days the organ had to be pumped. There was no electricity and that sort of thing. Or the organ was not electric. And you had a lot of other people who were called all sorts of names, and they existed here. So I think what Timothy Callender was doing is trying to relate to the fact that that St. Jude's had what he called these bad men. But they weren't bad men, because they were so close to one another. You had fights in all districts. But there was this proverbial set of people from St. Victoria and St. Philip. I've never found that St. Victoria. I know there's a St. Victoria and St. John. And these guys, he would claim, come here and they got a song beating. I wouldn't doubt that it could not have happened, and he might have seen that. But that is where that came from in relation to these characters we had in St. Jude's, who were pretty tough. I was, as I said, it was in the 50s, was 4 or 5, that sort of age 3. And I knew some of these guys pretty well. And that is a relatively fairish representation of some of the things that happened in St. Jude's. Because in St. Jude's, on the weekend, a lot of guys involved in gambling, like all of the districts. So you had the sort of allocations. And the term Kadooment. Now, crop over is something that is now national. Crop over used to be a village thing. Crop over will start on the plantation, the last day of the crop. When it's finished, the horns will blow about 4 or 5 times during the day. Everybody knows, don't come to work tomorrow to cut any canes. All the canes have been cut. So in the evening, they would have drinks. The plantation would provide some drinks. The fellows would buy some drinks on the plantation. And like, let's say it's Ashbury Plantation, which is up there. They would walk right down here, and they couldn't get past the rum shop. So it was bacchanal and that sort of thing. And the term Kadooment came out of something like that. A Kadooment was altercation, let's call it. That's what they call it. And you had a lot of Kadooment at the standpipe. There were 2 standpipes in St. Jude's, and there was no running water to houses, as I said, so everybody had pit latrines. And everybody want to get their bucket under the pipe first. There's a line, but there's some people who don't mind no line, and that sort of thing will go. And that's a Kadooment. A Kadooment will start from that, because they're trying to gain an advantage over somebody else. And that Kadooment was a real thing. If you hear Kadooment happening, everybody is going to run to that Kadooment, because they want to see what is happening. Those days, there are no guns, nobody using no swords, it's fists and shoving and that sort of thing. And that is really where Kadooment came from. And I knew about Kadooment from the time I was very small. And that is also part of what the landship was about in terms of the Kadooment, in terms of the Madasali.
The colour of St. George is red. In a sense, we have had our own Kadooment. 1 hour with Desmond Critchlow as he crystallized his experiences of life in St. Jude's and its surrounding communities. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thank you so much for staying with me. The news is up next. I'll be back at 7:30.